March 28, 2003, Sargat, northern Iraq. The village erupted in fire and smoke as American cruise missiles slammed into fortified positions dug into the hillsides. Within seconds, the morning calm transformed into a symphony of destruction. Explosions, screaming rockets, the distinctive crack of AK-47s firing back at invisible enemies. This wasn't Baghdad. This wasn't the televised invasion dominating global news. This was Operation Viking Hammer, a battle most Americans never heard about, fought by a force they didn't know existed, in a corner of Iraq that maps barely showed. Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, their traditional shalwar kameez covered by mismatched military gear, charged uphill toward enemy bunkers. Beside them, fewer than 70 American Special Forces operators directed airstrikes with laser designators, coordinated artillery fire, and led assaults against one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations on Earth. Their enemy, Ansar al-Islam, a fundamentalist group that would later merge with Al-Qaeda in Iraq and eventually become ISIS. Their objective: eliminate a terrorist stronghold before it could threaten American forces advancing from the south. The mathematics were staggering. Approximately 10,000 Kurdish fighters and a handful of Green Berets against an estimated 600 to 800 hardened jihadists entrenched in mountains they knew intimately, fortified positions prepared over years, and a willingness to die that made them more dangerous than Saddam's entire army. What happened in those 6 days of fighting would prove decisive for the Iraq War's northern front. But because no embedded journalists covered it, because the battles were fought far from cameras, because special operations forces don't advertise their work, Operation Viking Hammer became a footnote, a classified mission that deserved to be legendary. This is that story. To understand Operation Viking Hammer, you must first understand Kurdistan, a nation without borders, a people divided among 4 countries, and one of the Middle East's most complicated political situations. The Kurds, numbering approximately 30 million, formed one of the world's largest ethnic groups without their own state. After World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and European powers carved up the Middle East, the Kurds found themselves split among Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. In Iraq, Kurds comprised roughly 20% of the population, concentrated in the mountainous north. Saddam Hussein viewed them as threats to Iraqi unity and dealt with their resistance movements through genocidal brutality. The Anfal campaign of 1988 saw Iraqi forces systematically destroy Kurdish villages, execute thousands of civilians, and deploy chemical weapons against Kurdish towns. The attack on Halabja killed 5,000 people in a single day. Men, women, children dying from sarin, tabun, and mustard gas. After the 1991 Gulf War, the United States and coalition partners established a no-fly zone over northern Iraq, effectively creating an autonomous Kurdish region protected from Saddam's air force. For 12 years, Iraqi Kurdistan existed as a semi-independent entity, not quite a nation, not quite still part of Iraq. 2 main political parties dominated: the Kurdistan Democratic Party, KDP, led by Masoud Barzani, and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, PUK, led by Jalal Talabani. They'd fought a bitter civil war in the 1990s, but had reconciled by 2003, united by the prospect of Saddam's overthrow. The Kurds maintained their own fighting force, the Peshmerga, literally, those who face death. These weren't regular soldiers with standardized equipment and training. They were militia fighters, some seasoned by decades of guerrilla warfare, others civilians who grabbed rifles when their villages were threatened. Their weapons were eclectic: AK-47s captured from Iraqi forces, Soviet-era machine guns, RPGs of various generations, and artillery pieces that belonged in museums. Their uniforms were whatever they wore: traditional Kurdish clothing, old Iraqi army gear, civilian clothes with ammunition vests. But what the Peshmerga lacked in equipment, they compensated for with motivation. This wasn't abstract geopolitics for them. They'd buried children killed by Saddam's forces. They'd fled villages bulldozed by Iraqi army. They'd survived chemical attacks. When American forces began planning the Iraq invasion, Kurdish leaders saw opportunity. If Saddam fell, Kurdish autonomy could become permanent. Maybe finally Kurdistan could emerge as a recognized nation. But between Kurdish territory and that dream stood a significant obstacle: Ansar al-Islam. Ansar al-Islam, supporters of Islam, emerged in 2001 from a merger of radical Islamist groups in northern Iraq's mountains. Unlike the secular Kurdish nationalist movements, Ansar embraced fundamentalist Salafist ideology aligned with Al-Qaeda. The group controlled a small territory along the Iranian border, centered on villages like Biara, Tawela, and Sargat. The terrain was formidable: steep mountains, narrow valleys, caves that had sheltered fighters for centuries. Ansar's membership included Iraqi Kurds radicalized by extreme interpretations of Islam, Arab jihadists who'd fought in Afghanistan, and foreign fighters from across the Middle East. Their leader, Mullah Krekar, had connections to Al-Qaeda leadership and had spent time in Osama bin Laden's camps. American intelligence believed Ansar al-Islam represented a direct threat for several reasons. First, they possessed chemical weapons capabilities. A Kurdish operative who'd infiltrated the group provided evidence of laboratories producing ricin and other toxins. If these weapons reached Al-Qaeda networks, they could be used for terrorist attacks against Western targets. Second, the group harbored Al-Qaeda operatives who'd fled Afghanistan after the U.S. invasion. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who would later become the founder of what evolved into ISIS, allegedly received medical treatment and safe haven in Ansar territory. Third, their strategic position threatened Kurdish-controlled areas. Ansar conducted assassinations, bombings, and raids against PUK positions, creating instability that complicated American invasion planning. Finally, allowing a terrorist enclave to survive during the invasion would undermine the entire operation's premise that America was eliminating terrorist threats. Ansar al-Islam's fighters were committed, experienced, and dug into positions they'd fortified over 2 years. They'd constructed bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, established weapons caches throughout the mountains, and positioned heavy machine guns and mortars at key choke points. Intelligence estimates suggested between 600 and 800 fighters, a relatively small force but occupying terrain so difficult that dislodging them would require significantly larger numbers, substantial firepower, and coordination that Kurdish forces had never demonstrated. The Peshmerga had fought Ansar sporadically since 2001, but every offensive had failed. The mountains favored defense. Attackers advancing uphill faced concentrated fire from fortified positions. Casualties mounted quickly, and without artillery or air support, the Peshmerga couldn't suppress defensive positions. By early 2003, as American forces massed in Kuwait for the invasion, Ansar al-Islam's territory remained a festering problem. The question was whether to ignore it, hoping it wouldn't interfere with operations, or eliminate it before the main invasion began. The American military presence in northern Iraq before the invasion was minimal. Roughly 100 Special Forces soldiers from 10th Special Forces Group, Airborne, organized into Operational Detachment Alphas, ODAs. These weren't conventional infantry soldiers. Special Forces, commonly called Green Berets, specialized in unconventional warfare, working with indigenous forces, conducting reconnaissance, directing airstrikes, and achieving strategic objectives with minimal American footprint. Each ODA, typically 12 soldiers, included weapons specialists, communications experts, medics, and engineers. They spoke local languages, understood regional cultures, and excelled at building relationships with foreign military forces. Beginning in early 2003, these ODAs infiltrated into northern Iraq, linking up with Kurdish Peshmerga units. Their mission: prepare Kurdish forces to support the American invasion from the north, gather intelligence on Iraqi positions, and identify targets for airstrikes. Several teams were specifically assigned to work with PUK forces facing Ansar al-Islam. These operators assessed the enemy positions, mapped defensive fortifications, and began planning an operation to eliminate the terrorist enclave. The plan that emerged, Operation Viking Hammer, was ambitious and risky. American Special Forces would embed with Peshmerga units, coordinate the assault using American air power and precision fires, and personally lead attacks on the most critical objectives. The concept relied on marrying Kurdish manpower with American technology and tactical expertise. Peshmerga fighters would conduct the actual assaults, climbing the mountains and clearing bunkers. American operators would direct supporting fires, ensure coordination between different Kurdish units, and provide real-time intelligence. It was unconventional warfare at its essence, a handful of Americans multiplying the effectiveness of indigenous forces against a common enemy. Colonel Charlie Cleveland, commanding the Special Forces Battalion, understood the strategic importance. Eliminating Ansar al-Islam before the invasion would remove a terrorist threat, demonstrate American-Kurdish partnership, and prove to skeptical Kurdish leaders that working with U.S. forces brought tangible results. The mission was approved. ODAs received orders to prepare Peshmerga units for the assault. Intelligence assets, drones, satellites, signals intercepts focused on Ansar positions, building detailed target folders for every significant defensive position. By late March 2003, everything was ready. The invasion of Iraq was about to begin, but in the mountains of northern Iraq, a different war would start first. The assault began before dawn on March 28, 2003, with a barrage that announced American military power had arrived in Kurdistan. Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from Navy ships in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea streaked across Iraq, their GPS guidance systems directing them toward pre-programmed coordinates in Ansar-controlled territory. Each missile carried a 1,000-pound warhead designed to destroy hardened targets. The missiles struck within minutes of each other, a coordinated bombardment hitting command centers, ammunition depots, and fortified positions simultaneously. The explosions illuminated the night sky, visible from Kurdish positions miles away. Immediately following the cruise missile strikes, Air Force bombers arrived overhead. B-52s dropped strings of precision-guided bombs on trench lines and bunker complexes. Navy F-14 Tomcats and FA-18 Hornets conducted close air support missions, striking targets identified by Special Forces operators on the ground. The bombardment was unlike anything Kurdish fighters had witnessed. For years, they'd fought Ansar with small arms and improvised tactics, unable to suppress enemy positions effectively. Now, American firepower was systematically destroying fortifications that had seemed impregnable. Master Sergeant Pete Panic, a Special Forces operator embedded with PUK forces, directed strikes using a laser designator. He'd identify a target, a bunker, a mortar position, a machine gun nest, paint it with his laser, and within minutes watch aircraft deliver bombs with precision that seemed impossible. Bunker complex at grid coordinates. Panic would radio to airborne controllers. Minutes later, the bunker would disappear in an explosion, replaced by a crater and debris. But airstrikes alone couldn't win the battle. Ansar fighters, despite the bombardment, remained in positions throughout the mountains. Tunnels and caves protected them from aerial attack. Fortifications built into hillsides survived even direct hits. To actually seize the territory, Kurdish forces would have to advance uphill against enemies who'd spent years preparing these defenses. At approximately 800 hours, the ground assault began. 10,000 Peshmerga fighters, organized into several large formations, advanced toward Ansar positions from multiple directions. The assault wasn't a coordinated military operation in the Western sense. It was more like several simultaneous attacks, each led by different Kurdish commanders, loosely coordinated by American Special Forces advisors. The terrain favored defense overwhelmingly. Peshmerga forces had to advance uphill across open ground, exposing themselves to fire from elevated positions. Ansar fighters, dug into bunkers and trenches, could fire down at attackers while remaining largely protected. The initial advances took heavy casualties. Peshmerga fighters advancing in groups too large and too exposed were cut down by machine gun fire. RPGs exploded among advancing formations. Mortar rounds, pre-registered on likely approach routes, landed with devastating accuracy. Some Kurdish units broke and retreated. Others went to ground, unable to advance but unwilling to flee. A few, led by particularly brave or reckless commanders, pushed forward despite casualties. American Special Forces operators moved with the Peshmerga, sometimes leading from the front, sometimes hanging back to coordinate fires, always exposing themselves to the same dangers facing their Kurdish partners. Sergeant First Class Chris Spear, a medic with ODA 391, treated casualties under fire. Peshmerga fighters with gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and blast trauma. He'd work on wounded men while bullets cracked overhead, stabilizing them enough for evacuation to rear aid stations. The casualties were mounting. Kurdish commanders reported dozens dead, hundreds wounded. Some units had suffered 50% casualties in the first hours. The advance was stalling. This was the critical moment when operations succeed or fail, when casualties mount, when soldiers question whether objectives are worth the cost, when momentum either sustains or collapses. The difference maker was American air power, directed with precision by Special Forces operators, embedded at every level. When a Peshmerga unit got pinned down by machine gun fire, an American operator would call in an airstrike. Within minutes, an F-16 would deliver a precision-guided bomb that eliminated the enemy position. The Peshmerga would advance. When Kurdish fighters encountered a fortified bunker they couldn't suppress, an American Green Beret would mark it with a laser. A bomb would destroy it. The advance continued. This pattern repeated throughout the day. Advance, encounter resistance, call for air support, eliminate the threat, advance again. The Peshmerga provided manpower and local knowledge. American forces provided firepower and coordination. By afternoon, Ansar positions were crumbling. The sustained bombardment, combined with ground pressure from multiple directions, overwhelmed defenses that had seemed impregnable hours earlier. Not every position could be eliminated with airstrikes. Some required close combat, infantry assaults against prepared defenses, the kind of fighting that produces the highest casualties. One particularly fortified position, a bunker complex overlooking the village of Guligoban, had survived multiple airstrikes. The bunkers were partially underground, reinforced with logs and earth, with firing ports that allowed defenders to engage attackers while remaining protected. A Peshmerga unit, supported by an ODA, was tasked with taking the position. The approach was nightmarish. 500 meters of uphill advance across rocky terrain with minimal cover, all while under fire from the bunkers above. The assault began with smoke grenades obscuring the attackers' approach. Peshmerga fighters moved in small groups, using boulders and terrain folds for cover. American operators moved with them, directing suppressive fire from supporting positions. But smoke couldn't hide them completely. Ansar fighters in the bunkers opened fire with machine guns and RPGs. Tracer rounds arced down the hillside. Explosions threw up fountains of rock and dirt. The Peshmerga assault wavered. Men went to ground, returning fire but unable to advance. The bunker's interlocking fields of fire created kill zones that seemed impassable. Staff Sergeant Robert Farmer, leading his ODA's assault element, recognized the attack was failing. Without momentum, casualties would mount and the assault would collapse. He made a decision that typified Special Forces operations in northern Iraq. He'd personally lead the assault. Farmer moved forward through the Peshmerga positions, shouting in Kurdish for fighters to follow him. His team sergeant and several other Americans came with him. Behind them, inspired by seeing the Americans advance directly into enemy fire, Peshmerga fighters rose and followed. The final assault up the hillside was brutal. Farmer and his team fired as they moved, suppressing bunker firing ports with sustained bursts from their M4 carbines and squad automatic weapons. Peshmerga fighters threw grenades into bunker entrances. Close-range firefights erupted as Ansar defenders emerged to fight hand-to-hand. The battle for the bunker complex lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the position was secured, but at significant cost. Several Peshmerga killed, more wounded, and Farmer himself hit by shrapnel from an RPG that exploded near his position. He refused evacuation, staying with his Kurdish fighters as they consolidated the position and prepared to continue the advance. This scene repeated across the battlefield. American Special Forces operators, theoretically advisors who should remain behind front lines, instead led assaults because that's what the tactical situation demanded. They carried wounded Peshmerga fighters. They personally cleared bunkers. They fought alongside the Kurdish soldiers who'd become their brothers. Sargat village represented Ansar al-Islam's administrative and spiritual center. Intelligence suggested the leadership was headquartered there, along with the alleged chemical weapons laboratories that justified the entire operation. Taking Sargat meant fighting through a village transformed into a fortress. Buildings had been fortified with sandbags and firing ports. Streets were blocked with obstacles and likely mined. Ansar had positioned snipers in multi-story structures overlooking approach routes. The assault on Sargat began on March 29th, after a night of sustained bombardment. B-52s dropped dozens of bombs on identified positions. Artillery brought forward by Kurdish forces pounded the village. By dawn, much of Sargat was burning. But Ansar fighters remained, dug into positions throughout the village, determined to defend their stronghold to the death. The village had to be cleared building by building, a process requiring infantry to enter structures where enemies waited in ambush. This was the most dangerous combat, close-range firefights in confined spaces where superior firepower mattered less than surprise and determination. ODA 391, working with a Peshmerga battalion, pushed into Sargat from the north. They moved through rubble-strewn streets, clearing buildings methodically. Each structure followed the same pattern. Throw grenades through windows, wait for explosions, enter fast with weapons ready. Some buildings were empty. Defenders had fled or been killed by airstrikes. Others erupted with gunfire as Ansar fighters, concealed in prepared positions, opened fire at point-blank range. During one building clearing, a Peshmerga fighter stepped through a doorway directly into an ambush. An Ansar fighter hiding behind an interior wall opened fire, hitting the Peshmerga multiple times. Before the insurgent could shift fire to others, a Special Forces operator killed him with a burst from his M4. The wounded Peshmerga was dragged to cover. The Special Forces medic worked to stabilize him, but the wounds were catastrophic. Multiple hits to the torso, massive blood loss, organs damaged. Despite aggressive treatment, the fighter died within minutes. This was the cost of urban combat. Even when you won, you lost men. The fighting for Sargat continued for 2 days. Every street, every building, every room had to be secured. Ansar fighters didn't surrender. They fought until killed, accepting death as martyrdom. By March 31st, Sargat was secured. Kurdish flags flew over buildings that days earlier had been enemy strongholds. Peshmerga fighters celebrated, firing weapons into the air, embracing the American operators who'd fought beside them. But the victory was tempered by the butcher's bill. Estimates suggested the Peshmerga had suffered over 100 killed and several hundred wounded. Ansar al-Islam had lost far more, perhaps 300 to 400 dead, with survivors fleeing into Iran or melting into the civilian population. With Sargat secured, American forces immediately searched for the alleged chemical weapons laboratories that had justified the operation. A joint team of Special Forces operators and specialists from the 75th Exploitation Task Force, an intelligence unit tasked with finding weapons of mass destruction, began searching buildings identified by intelligence as possible production sites. They found evidence, but not what they'd hoped for. In one building, they discovered chemical equipment, beakers, tubes, protective gear. Substances tested positive for traces of ricin and cyanide compounds. Documents described production processes for toxins, but this wasn't a sophisticated weapons program. It was a laboratory capable of producing small quantities of chemical agents, possibly for use in terrorist attacks or assassinations, but nothing approaching the industrial-scale production suggested by pre-war intelligence. The discovery was significant but not definitive. Ansar al-Islam had possessed some chemical weapons capability, validating concerns about the group's threat, but the scale was far smaller than feared, and there was no evidence linking it to Saddam Hussein's regime, the connection American intelligence had suspected but never proven. Secretary of State Colin Powell had referenced this site in his February 2003 United Nations speech, suggesting it represented proof of Iraq's WMD programs and terrorist connections. The reality was more ambiguous. A terrorist group with crude chemical capabilities, but nothing justifying the invasion's broader WMD claims. The discovery would fuel controversy for years. Supporters argued it validated the threat from Ansar al-Islam. Critics claimed it had been overstated to justify war. The truth was complex. The laboratory existed, the capability was real, but the implications were debatable. For the Special Forces operators who'd fought to capture it, the politics mattered less than the fact they'd eliminated a terrorist group that posed genuine threats to Kurdish civilians and American forces. Operation Viking Hammer's immediate effects were clear. Ansar al-Islam was shattered as a coherent organization. Their territory was captured. Their fighters were killed, captured, or scattered. The terrorist enclave that had threatened Kurdish civilians and complicated invasion planning ceased to exist. For Kurdistan's population, the victory was celebrated as liberation. Villages that had lived under Ansar's brutal rule, where music was banned, women were forced into strict Islamic dress codes, and perceived violations of Sharia law meant execution, were freed. Peshmerga forces, having fought alongside American military power, gained confidence and capabilities they'd lacked before. They'd seen how coordinated operations, precision firepower, and effective command could achieve objectives that seemed impossible with their previous tactics. Kurdish political leaders, Barzani and Talabani, solidified their partnership with American forces. This relationship would prove critical as the broader Iraq invasion unfolded. Kurdish forces, now battle-tested and coordinated with U.S. Special Operations, would play significant roles in securing northern Iraq. The conventional invasion from the south, which had begun simultaneously with Viking Hammer, was progressing rapidly toward Baghdad. In the north, Kurdish and American forces now turned their attention to Iraqi army positions defending approaches to Kirkuk and Mosul, major cities that Saddam's regime still controlled. But Ansar al-Islam, though defeated as an organization, hadn't been completely eliminated. Survivors fled across the Iranian border, where they found sanctuary and began regrouping. Others disappeared into Iraq's population, waiting for opportunities to resume their fight. One of Operation Viking Hammer's stated objectives was eliminating or capturing Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Jordanian terrorist who allegedly operated from Ansar territory. Zarqawi's presence had been highlighted in Colin Powell's UN speech as evidence of links between Saddam Hussein, Al-Qaeda, and terrorist groups. The narrative suggested Zarqawi had fled Afghanistan after the U.S. invasion, received medical treatment in Baghdad with regime approval, then moved to Ansar territory where he helped develop chemical weapons. The intelligence was fragmentary and contested. Some analysts believed Zarqawi had been in northern Iraq at some point. Others questioned whether he'd ever been there or whether the intelligence was manipulated to strengthen the case for invading Iraq. After Operation Viking Hammer, searches of Ansar territory found no evidence of Zarqawi's presence, no documents, no witnesses who'd seen him, no indication he'd been there during the assault. This raised troubling questions. Had intelligence been wrong? Had Zarqawi escaped before the operation? Or had his presence been overstated to justify the invasion? What's certain is that Zarqawi survived and would become America's most dangerous enemy in Iraq. He founded Tawhid wal Jihad, which pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda and became Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. His organization pioneered suicide bombings targeting Iraqi civilians, sectarian attacks designed to trigger civil war, and propaganda videos showing hostage executions. AQI would eventually evolve into the Islamic State of Iraq, then the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. The terrorist organization that conquered large portions of Iraq and Syria, declared a caliphate, and inspired attacks worldwide traced its lineage directly to Zarqawi. Whether eliminating Zarqawi in March 2003 would have prevented this trajectory is unknowable. But his survival meant that Operation Viking Hammer, while tactically successful, failed to prevent the emergence of the most dangerous terrorist organization of the 21st century. Ansar al-Islam, though defeated in March 2003, wasn't destroyed permanently. Survivors who'd fled to Iran began reorganizing. They recruited new fighters, established safe houses in border regions, and planned to return to Iraq. By late 2003, as the American occupation faced growing resistance, Ansar fighters began infiltrating back across the border. They found conditions favorable for their return. Iraq was descending into chaos. No functioning government, sectarian tensions rising. American forces focused on Sunni insurgency in central Iraq. The Kurdish north, though more stable than other regions, had porous borders that couldn't be effectively sealed. Ansar reconstituted as Ansar al-Sunnah, a reorganized version of the original group. They conducted attacks against Kurdish targets, assassinated government officials, and bombed civilian gatherings. In February 2004, simultaneous suicide bombings in Erbil killed over 100 people, demonstrating that the group had regained operational capabilities. American and Kurdish forces conducted repeated operations against reconstituted Ansar elements throughout the occupation. They captured or killed numerous fighters, disrupted cells, and prevented attacks. But completely eliminating the group proved impossible. For every fighter captured, another was recruited from the pool of young men radicalized by war and occupation. By 2007, many Ansar fighters had joined Al-Qaeda in Iraq, merging their organization into Zarqawi's larger network. Others maintained independence, conducting operations throughout Kurdistan and northern Iraq. The pattern illustrated a fundamental challenge of counterterrorism. Military operations can defeat terrorist organizations temporarily, but unless underlying conditions change, poverty, political grievances, radical ideologies, new organizations emerge to replace those destroyed. Operation Viking Hammer demonstrated the effectiveness of Special Forces' unconventional warfare methodology. With fewer than 100 American operators working with indigenous forces, the operation achieved strategic objectives that would have required thousands of conventional troops. The model, small American footprint, local partners providing manpower, American technology providing firepower, proved both effective and efficient. This success would influence American military strategy for the next 2 decades. The Special Forces model became the template for operations in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and across Africa and the Middle East. Rather than large-scale conventional invasions, the military increasingly relied on small teams of special operators working with local partners. The advantages were clear: lower American casualties, smaller logistical footprint, better cultural understanding through embedded advisors, and local ownership of military operations. But the model had limitations that became apparent over time. Indigenous forces, while knowing local terrain and culture, often lacked discipline, training, and motivation of professional militaries. Coordination was challenging when language barriers existed, and tactical concepts didn't translate directly. Political complications arose when American forces partnered with groups that had their own agendas. In Kurdistan, the partnership worked because interests aligned. Both Americans and Kurds wanted Ansar al-Islam eliminated, and both supported overthrowing Saddam. But in other contexts, where interests diverged or local partners proved unreliable, the model struggled. The Special Forces operators who fought at Viking Hammer became legends within the Special Operations community. Their awards included Silver Stars, Bronze Stars with Valor, and Purple Hearts. Several were killed in subsequent operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, their names now inscribed on memorials honoring Special Operations casualties. Operation Viking Hammer was a pivotal moment in Kurdistan's modern history. The partnership with American forces forged in combat against Ansar al-Islam established relationships that would define Kurdistan's role in post-Saddam Iraq. When the new Iraqi constitution was written, Kurdish leaders negotiated substantial autonomy for their region, including control over their own security forces. The Peshmerga, having fought alongside Americans, received training, equipment, and funding that transformed them from militia into a more professional force. They would prove critical in subsequent fights against insurgents and later against ISIS. When ISIS swept across Iraq in 2014, conquering Mosul and threatening Baghdad, the Peshmerga held the line in the north. They defended Kurdish territory, protected religious minorities fleeing ISIS genocide, and eventually participated in offensives that recaptured ISIS-held areas. American Special Forces returned to Kurdistan during the ISIS conflict, once again partnering with Peshmerga against a common enemy. Veterans of Operation Viking Hammer found themselves back in northern Iraq, working with some of the same Kurdish commanders they'd fought beside in 2003. This continuity, American special operators and Kurdish fighters partnering against terrorist threats across 2 decades, illustrated both the enduring nature of the relationship and the persistence of the threats that necessitated it. But Kurdistan's political trajectory remained complicated. Despite autonomy within Iraq, full independence remained elusive. A 2017 referendum showed overwhelming Kurdish support for independence, but regional powers, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, all opposed it. Economic pressures and political isolation forced Kurdish leaders to retreat from independence claims. The dream of an independent Kurdistan, which had seemed achievable after Saddam's fall, remained unfulfilled 20 years later. Operation Viking Hammer lasted 6 days. Conventional histories of the Iraq War mention it briefly, if at all, but its significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The operation demonstrated that unconventional warfare, small American forces partnering with indigenous fighters, could achieve strategic objectives quickly and with minimal American casualties. This model would define American military operations for the next 2 decades. It validated Kurdish fighting capabilities and established partnerships that would prove critical throughout Iraq's turbulent post-Saddam history. The Peshmerga, blooded in combat alongside American forces, became one of Iraq's most effective military forces. It eliminated, at least temporarily, a terrorist enclave that posed genuine threats to Kurdish civilians and American forces. While Ansar al-Islam would later reconstitute, the destruction of their mountain strongholds prevented them from interfering with the broader invasion. But the operation also illustrated limitations of military solutions to terrorism. Despite defeating Ansar militarily, the underlying conditions that produced extremism, sectarian tensions, economic deprivation, political grievances, remained unaddressed. New terrorist organizations emerged to replace those destroyed. The chemical weapons discoveries, while validating concerns about Ansar's capabilities, proved far less significant than pre-war intelligence suggested. This gap between intelligence assessments and battlefield reality would characterize the entire Iraq War, undermining public trust in the justifications for invasion. And the failure to capture or kill Zarqawi meant that the operation's most important objective went unachieved. Zarqawi would go on to found the organization that became ISIS, creating threats far exceeding anything Ansar al-Islam could have posed. For the Special Forces operators who fought there, Operation Viking Hammer represented the kind of mission they'd trained for, working with indigenous forces, achieving strategic objectives with minimal American presence, conducting operations that conventional forces couldn't execute. For the Peshmerga fighters who died on those mountainsides, the operation was about liberation, freeing Kurdish villages from terrorist occupation, proving their capability to fight alongside the world's most powerful military, and taking another step toward the independence they'd sought for generations. For the Ansar al-Islam fighters who died defending their positions, the operation was religious war, martyrdom in defense of their interpretation of Islam against what they viewed as crusaders and apostates. And for the Kurdish civilians who'd lived under Ansar's brutal rule, the operation meant freedom, the ability to play music again, to educate daughters, to live without fear of arbitrary execution for violating extremist interpretations of religious law. Operation Viking Hammer was a small battle in a large war. Fewer than 100 Americans working with 10,000 Kurds fought 6 days against hundreds of terrorists in mountains most people couldn't find on a map. But those 6 days shaped northern Iraq's trajectory, demonstrated new models of American warfare, and eliminated terrorist threats that could have killed thousands. The battle deserved to be remembered. This is its story, one bullet away from being forgotten, preserved here so that the sacrifice, courage, and complexity of those days in the mountains aren't lost to history. The Special Forces operators returned to other missions. The Peshmerga fighters went home to their villages. The mountains of northern Iraq returned to quieter days. But the echoes of Operation Viking Hammer, the partnerships forged, the tactics validated, the terrorists defeated, and the questions raised about intelligence and the nature of terrorism continue reverberating through Middle Eastern politics and American military strategy 2 decades later. In the end, Viking Hammer was what all military operations ultimately are. Young men fighting and dying for causes larger than themselves, in places far from home, believing their sacrifice mattered. Whether history validates that belief depends on perspectives shaped by politics, ideology, and the passage of time. But the courage displayed on those mountainsides, by American operators and Kurdish fighters alike, deserves recognition regardless of the war's broader controversies. They fought, they bled, they won. And then, like most special operations victories, their battle disappeared into classified files and faded from public memory. This was Operation Viking Hammer, the forgotten battle that helped shape the Iraq War, validated unconventional warfare models, and demonstrated that even in wars dominated by conventional forces and televised battles, small groups of determined warriors can achieve strategic objectives through courage, partnership, and precision.